redeemed through sacrifice. In him
there we are. 1 Kings chapter 7. So I did something, I don't know if you've realized it by the slide. I took James off of it. Because it's kind of confusing what I'm doing, so I want to spend a few minutes when I get to my notes. Sheesh, I should have had this predetermined. So it seems a little confusing, but it's not confusing because in my head it's perfectly clear. So I want to help you all to what I'm thinking and what's going on. So I started studying the book of James, and I got bogged down with the idea of wisdom. Because if you lack wisdom, ask, right? And the moment I ask, I should get it because God gives generously, yes? But there's a problem with that. What's wisdom? What are you looking for? What's happening with that? So one thing led to another. I started looking at Ecclesiastes, which the man with wisdom wrote. Started looking at Proverbs, which the man with wisdom wrote. And I said, why don't I just look at the man? And I wanted to see what he asked for. So it started with that. So I got to 1 Kings, and I said, look, this is amazing, this man's life. And I said, I've never studied 1 Kings 1 through 11. I know very little about Solomon other than we have often regurgitated. You know, Solomon had a lot of wives and concubines. What is it called? Porcupines, the kid said. So, which could have been problematic to start with. That's all we kind of fixate on. So I said, I'm going to back up and I'm going to study 1 Kings 1 through 11. But I kept putting the slide up that says Introduction to James, which it kind of is, because isn't the Bible an introduction to the Bible? Aren't all books working together? So I dropped that because for right now we're going to go through 1 Kings. We only have till chapter 11, we'll be fine. And most of you just said, get to 11 already. No, we'll get there before you know it. But however, today's lesson is one of my favorite things in the book of Kings. It starts in chapter 7, verse 13. And it's a little confusing, so let's just go to this text. We'll read the first couple of verses. If you notice, it says up here, 13 through 51. And many of you say, he'll never make it. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to do my best. And if it doesn't, I'll stop and we'll pick it up with chapter 8 next week. I really want to kind of chunk this and kind of move on too. Sometimes I can't get out of my own way. Like I just spent 3 minutes on an introduction most of you might have already thought about. So let's read at least the first 2 verses because it's kind of confusing. So it starts with an opening that assumes you as a reader know the difference. It says, now King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was a widow's son from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze, and he was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill for doing any work in bronze. So he came to Solomon and performed all his work. So if you see right off the bat, we have another guy that seems just like Solomon. And he's also called Hiram, and Hiram is also the king of Tyre. So is this the same guy? And how interesting that 2 different guys would have this name. So we're going to look at this and examine this. But I want to kind of talk to you about a few things. So we're going to look at the finishing work on the temple. This guy is brought in to do the finished work. He's not inside it. He's not building the temple itself, not the foundation, not the inside. He's building all the outside additions that are needed for this temple. And when you're doing it, and you're doing a building project, I would say this. Most of you don't want to hire the cheapest guy. You want to hire the best guy. And you're praying he's also the cheapest guy, okay? So years ago in 1995, Angie's List was started. Anybody ever heard of Angie's List? Come on, most of you have. I'm sure none of you have used it, or tried to. But Angie's List was founded by Angie Hicks and a William Osterell because of the reason Angie worked for William. She was working for him. And she was building her house, and she wanted a reliable construction contractor in her suburban Columbus, Ohio area. And since her boss, was a venture capitalist, it kind of worked out well that they got a partnership. Today, millions of people have used this site, and it's now called Angie, to find a trustworthy and skilled workman to do their things, to do their stuff, to build their projects. Even today, we have different sites that say, I recommend this guy wholeheartedly. What a great job he did building this or that for me, or helping me do that. We also need to find out if they're licensed, to see what work they've done. In other words, do they come in with a portfolio to show us what they've done? So we want to hire somebody who is skillful, ready for this? Who's skillful, full of wisdom and understanding to what we're doing, right? You don't want to hire somebody to do your deck work, or just for instance, you're doing a deck, and he doesn't even know what a deck is. He thinks it's cards. You know, that'd be problematic to the start. And you say, hey, he gave me a good bid, and he's really done really good things with fireplaces. You know, so Solomon is doing the world's greatest building project. And he wants to look for the number one contractor to do the finish work, which I believe is pretty important. Because when you walk into a structure, you say, wow, that was well done. You're just looking on the outside. So some of the things he does has to do with the outside of the house of the Lord. And again, I don't know if I can even choose the right words to express this building. Because it's hard, you say it's a building, but we call it the house of the Lord. But the significance and importance of this is tremendous. And I don't know if we could focus on that enough to get that, to understand that. So we would want the best. Solomon gets the best. And I believe he got it from talking to the king of Tyre, Hiram, who said Hiram's the best, which that would have been a whole interesting conversation. But we'll talk about it as we get there. So first of all, Solomon is sent to Hiram the second in verse 13. And the reason I put Hiram squared, I want to distinguish it. Squared means this is the guy we're talking about in the building project. Hiram with the exponent of 1, that's the king. Okay? So it's interesting. We'll talk about it briefly, but Hiram is his Hebrew name. But Hiram is also King of Tyre's Hebrew name. So we can't say, well, one book, Chronicles, says Hiram, and it's really Hiram. They're the same name. It's splitting hairs that I'm not going to do. But I want you to do this. I want you to go to 2 Chronicles. Hold your finger in 1 Kings. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 2. 2 Chronicles chapter 2. And the reason we do this is a parallel passage. That shouldn't have been up there, but I'm going to give you some thoughts on Hiram, and then the map we'll get to in a minute. Ignore the map. Chapter 2, 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 13 says, and now I'm sending a skilled man, so this is Huram, which it says in verse 11, Huram, king of Tyre, which is Hiram. He's sending to Solomon, I'm sending you a skilled man endowed with understanding, Huram Abi, the son of a Dananite woman and a Tyrian father, who knows how to work in gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, and wood, and in purple, violet, linen, and crimson fabrics, and who knows how to make all kinds of engravings to execute any design which may be assigned to him, to work with your skilled men and with those of my lord David your father. Now, this is kind of an interesting concept that's going on here. So let me kind of say, first of all, this guy is a good finish contractor. If anybody knows that, that's the guy that comes in and puts all the trim work up, does a really good job of doing the fine woodwork, can do ceiling moldings if you got a house, and knows all those things. He can do beautiful finish work. Okay? Not only that, he's capable in every metal there is. And when we talk about what he does, it's going to be whoa over the top. Because I don't know how he does it, but I know he does it. So we're not going to get into the how-tos. This isn't a YouTube video. But we're going to go into what he actually does because I think it's important. So as we've looked at, according to what Chronicles says, Hiram, the king of Tyre, sends a letter to Solomon, verse 11, sends a letter to Solomon. So we have the first indication of the royal mail. This is how the post office worked in these times. You send a letter, this guy with a horse from Tyre into Jerusalem to Solomon. And Huram acknowledges, which is fascinating, because look at verse 11. He says, because the Lord loves his people. Huram is telling Solomon this is going to happen because the Lord loves his people. I don't know where Huram is as far king of Tyre. Huram exponent 1, where he is as far as his belief system, but he understands because we're not told anything other than that he talks about the Lord. He uses Yahovah. He uses that tetragrammaton to talk about the Lord. When you see it all in capitals, he's using that significant word. He says, Yahovah loves his people. He has made you king over them. So that's the opening of the letter, acknowledging who Solomon is, acknowledging the Lord who was appointed Solomon over king of all Israel, using that significance of a covenant-keeping God, which is that whole thing fascinates me. In verse 12, though, goes, then Huram continued, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel. Well, whoa. These are great words he's using. He has a really solid understanding. He's blessing God. When we look at Solomon's prayer in a few weeks, he opens up the prayer basically with the same idea, blessing God. And that God was the creator God. And it's a wonderful, he's writing a letter acknowledging the one true divine creator God. But here we could say, if anything, he's doing it in a letter, not in a prayer, but it's significant. He acknowledges this creator God has bestowed to Solomon insight and wisdom and understanding. This is an affirmation, especially referred to Solomon to resolve the building project, to finish it, the house of the Lord. In other words, it's God. Solomon has made the house of the Lord, the outside, the inside's finished. It's ready to be used, but it needs some last-minute details that need to be done that probably take significant time. And Solomon's palace is being built. And in verse 13, we've looked at it. He's sending Huram, who is Huram Abi, a man skilled. Same word, skilled. He has wisdom. He's endowed with binah, understanding. He is a man like Solomon. Remember what we said about Solomon? Solomon's been given wisdom to be king. doesn't have wisdom to have the most intricate life and do everything right in his life, his daily life, but he has wisdom to be king. And everything so far we've seen of Solomon in his life, he has shown that wisdom, even by allowing this guy to come in. Now, I'm going to say something real quick because I've got to switch slides. I put this on the wrong slide. However, I want you to see, I can't blow it up, but right there's Tyre. Dan, where this guy is from, Dan is, the northern tribe is right there where it says Damascus, right in that area is where Dan is. So Dan and Tyre are like close neighbors. Dan was one of the furthest north tribes that is. So when they had an allotment of land. So when we see this guy and his father is Tyrian, we'll talk about it in a minute, but I want you to notice the kinship of the area that it's in. It's not like he came from, down in this area and he was working in that, so this is kind of hard to distinguish. But I want to know who this guy is. Who is Haram Abi? And again, we've talked about this cross-reference where we're at. His name means, what happened? Oh, I left it blank. But it's fine. Since you look at Haram Abi, Abi means father. It's the first word in the Hebrew lexicon. You open up a Hebrew lexicon, the first word in there is father. So now you know the first word in the dictionary, Ab. Some people pronounce it Ab, but it's Ab, okay? It means father. It could be a title. Now, I'm saying this loosely because I know some of you walk away and say, oh, he's a priest because Father Humram. What does that mean? I don't think that's what it meant per se because he's not a priest. It could be Huram, my father. But I believe this name more than anything, it's meant to distinguish him from the king. I did it with an exponent. They did it by putting that name in it. In Phoenician, I know you all want to hear this, but this is important, sort of. Humram means benevolent brother. In Hebrew, it means most noble or exalted brother. So he's father and brother. It's kind of confusing. But it's kind of interesting because the inference is these two Hurams, the king and the builder, the king and the finish worker, are closely related. Not in like cousins or something like that, but they know each other real well. And we have to do something to clearly distinguish one from the other. You can't walk around and say, I'm not him, I'm him. So we do this in Scripture. We do things so that there's a difference between the king and him. And I believe his fame is locked in intrinsically to this building, that project that he takes on. His lineage, his mother is Danite. That's not a curse. There are people from the tribe of Dan. Everybody said, well, that tribe is cursed. Well, it wasn't at this time. His father is known as Tyrian from Tyre, but he's not from Tyre. Because according to what it says in 1 Kings 7, 13 and 14, which we looked at briefly to start this, his mother was a widow, and it says it's attached to the tribe of Naphtali. So here's what I think. His dad was from the tribe of Naphtali, which is, where's that map? Let's go back to the map, because you're going to have fun with this. I know this is not going to be, this is going to be like mind-bending. Dan is about right there. Naphtali is right there. So the two northern tribes abutted each other. So it'd be kind of almost natural that somebody from Dan marries somebody from Naphtali. It's not that difficult to figure out. They met at the grocery store, whatever. But they were related. The reason his father is a man of Tyre is because that's where he worked. That's where he worked. I don't think it's that hard, and people will say, well, his father was Gentile, and that was showing a picture that later the Jewish people reach out to the Gentile people via Jesus Christ. What does that say? That's the first class. That almost becomes allegorical. Why don't we just read what it says? And I don't have a problem that he was, again, established himself as a workman. Why would you not go where the work is? You know what Tyre had going on? They had building projects. They also had a place of worship being built. There was plenty of places at that time that were building projects. We could look, some of those still stand today somewhat. So his father's from the tribe of Naphtali. He established himself in Tyre. He might have even, for sake of conversation, he might have been born there. They're right next to each other. You know? Again, he's a worker with bronze. I would say this. because it's really hard to distinguish what's going on with this word bronze, and we'll get into that in a minute. But let's say he's a worker of metals. That would be easier, okay? And he died leaving his wife. In other words, dad had a job, and his apprentice was his son. So his dad worked in bronze, and he left a widow who was from the tribe of Dan. And all Huram, exponent 2, did was continue dad's business. Not that difficult. And it's really good when you have an apprentice to one of the better guys, you become sometimes a better worker at that. And it's interesting, all the things he worked with, iron and violet and purple and crimson, which is dyeing of fabrics, which is very intricate at that time. You just can't go to a store today and go to a bolt of fabric and say, that's a good color, I love it. You actually have to do that dyeing process. And he did all kinds of engravings, which is also very intricate work. But let me give you a couple of facts on this, which is kind of fascinating to me. Because the tribes of Dan and Naphtali, when Israel wandered the wilderness, they became the northern tribes of the nation during the time of Joshua. When their land was extended to the northern part, they could. So the northern top 3 tribes was Dan, Naphtali, and Asher. Okay? It all come into play when you see what's going on. Dan and Naphtali, however, are brothers. The tribes are brothers. They're brothers from Bilhah, who is Rachel's maid. So she only had 2 sons. They're both Dan and Naphtali. In Exodus 35:34, there's 2 guys who were skilled in every work. They were engravers, they were designers, they were embroiderers of fine fabric and weavers. They were Bezalel and Ahololab. Ahololab was from the tribe of Dan. So this has been a long road from the time of the Exodus all the way to the time of the kings, that somehow this tribe still had really skilled workers. Okay? So let's go a little bit further. Lineage. Huram was Jewish. Why do I say that? Because it's important. Because we see a Jewish guy being recommended by a foreign, pagan, Gentile king. It's kind of interesting. But here's the fact that you need to know. Being Jewish, he would align with what Solomon was trying to conquest, what Solomon was trying to do, what he was trying to accomplish. He understood building a house for the Lord and how much care that needed to be taken. And lastly, Huram, and Huram squared, was A number 1. Oh, that should be both of those guys are the same. I didn't put that. Anyway, whichever you want to call him, he was the best. He was A number 1 in his abilities. His skill set was the best. The king of Tyre was Solomon's friend. The king of Tyre had a covenant with Solomon. King of Tyre honors the God of Israel. And the king of Tyre sends to Solomon the very best. He didn't have to consult Angie. He sends the very best. And think about this for a minute. In all the Middle Eastern area, this guy was the best fit for the job. And I want to know what he does. I want to know what he builds. So let's talk about the 2 pillars of bronze that he makes. So let's go back to 1 Kings chapter 7. And you say, he'll never make 53. Hang on. Buckle up. So first of all, in verses 15 through 22, he's making these pillars. Well, let's start in verse 20. Let's just read it all. It talks about the size of them. First of all, they were freestanding pillars. He fashioned in verse 15 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar, and the line of 12 cubits measured the circumference of both. So we basically have a pillar that's 25 feet high and 18 inches in diameter. Okay, so 18 inches about this. So you got these pillars like that, and so you get the idea. He also made 2 capitals of molten bronze to set on the top. So the tops had these ornate caps because it was a hollow pillar, and he didn't want it to be filled with spiders. No, it's a cap. We'll talk about the cap in a minute. It's fascinating. The height of one capital was 5 cubits. The height of the other capital was 5 cubits. And there were nets of network and twisted threads of chain work for the capitals, which were on the top of the pillars. 7 for the one capital and 7 for the other capital. He made the pillars and 2 rows around one on the one network to cover the capitals, which were on top of the pomegranates. And so he did for the other capital. And the capitals which were on the top of the pillars in the porch were of lily design, 4 cubits. And there were capitals of the 2 pillars, even above and close to the rounded projection, which was beside the network. And the pomegranates numbered 200 in rows, both around the capitals. Thus, he set up the pillars at the porch of the nave, and he set up the right pillar and named it Shocking. And on the other, he set up the left pillar and named it Boaz. That's exciting. We'll see that. And on the top of the pillars was a lily design, so the work of the pillars were finished. So let's go through some quick facts that have to do with this. First of all, we already talked about the size. It was made of bronze. Bronze is used 140 times in the Bible, and I have a problem with bronze because bronze is kind of boring. You know, that's my personal opinion. Some translations, I don't know if you have it, say brass. That's horrible. Because I don't know what brass is other than a section in a band, the brass section, okay? Now, let me just tell you this. Brass is a combination of copper and zinc. It wasn't fully known and used to about the 13th century to 17th century. So it couldn't have been brass. Bronze is a combination of copper and tin. I know that's all exciting. All you guys are going to be, I'm going to be metallurgist when we walk out of here. But I want you to know their combination. But copper's copper. So I believe he built the first copper top batteries. They were copper top, which also took care because, you know, copper tarnishes. But I believe he was so skilled in it, it did not. But just imagine copper. And I think that's important to see that. And as he did this, he made it ornate. It had 2 capitals that were on it. And again, the tops of just the capitals were 7.5 feet high. That's pretty big capital put up there and lifted up there. We call them today, if you're doing engineering, they're called hat trusses. Anybody ever heard of that? You put a hat on and it kind of stabilizes you. So if you have a hat on, you don't wibble. Not necessarily true. But if you think about it in construction, when you put a cap on it, a hat, it helps the stability of the object it's doing. Now remember, the pillars were hollow. So this guy built something, not only the pillars, but he built something to keep it stable and keep it upright and give it stability. It had 7 networks of chain nets. I'm not sure exactly what these look like, but it's kind of interesting to see how he was attention to details. And these chains were likened to like a necklace around the beauty of the artwork that was being done. And then it says it's had 2 rows of pomegranates. I know most of you probably, how many of you have actually eaten a pomegranate and like it? Okay, that's good. I don't care. It's to me, when I opened it up, my first time I ever opened a pomegranate, I said, that's a lot of work. And what do you do with all those seeds? Now, here's the interesting thing. Pomegranates came to be known as a symbol for righteousness, which is fun. Here's how it came that way. Ready for this? If you count the seeds, I've never done this, so this is what they say. If you count the seeds, there's 613 seeds in a pomegranate. Now, this is where we're going to first class. So those that were in first class can say, oh. So 613 seeds represent 613 laws. So every time you look at a pomegranate, you should think of the commandments and the Torah itself. Fun. I just think it was there for decorations. Okay? Just like you cannot look at my Christmas tree at home and tell me, wow, those ornaments are so, this is, you know, some of them do have meanings, but most of them are just bulbs, you know. Pomegranates and figs along with grapes were brought out of the promised land by the spies. This is what they found in the land the first time they came in, so it was very important to remember those spies who had come in the land and said, this is a land that we have known as the land of Israel, as a land of milk and honey. And again, that's interesting. As you look through all these things later, Israel moaned that they were taken from Egypt to a wretched place. And they say this in Numbers chapter 20. It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there water to drink. What are you talking about? The spies had just got through telling you they're there. Now you're saying they're not. Then also says something about lily work. Again, lilies kind of represent things and emphasize beauty and purity and grace. I don't know what else to do with that. But again, it's ornamentation. It's beautiful. Designing things. We talked about palm trees and flowers and cherubim, all sorts of things. And the temple was intricately and purposefully ornate. That's all it comes down to. So we can say the pillars are finished. Then comes the fun part. The sea is cast. The sea. They call this big basin a sea. I want to know how the plumbing works. Now, bear with me because it is kind of somewhat humorous. So when you get to verse 23, it says, he made the sea of cast metal 10 cubits from the brim to brim, circular in form, and its height was 5 cubits and 30 cubits in circumference. Again, it's a big round ball. Think of your cooking bowls that you mix things in 500 times bigger. It's huge. It's huge. I had a picture of the temple that I've been showing for weeks. If you can remember, there was a big iron bowl out front. That's what we're talking about. So let's kind of go into this a little bit further, read more. Verse 24 says, under its brim was gourds, went around and circling in 10 to a cubit, completely surrounding the sea. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with the rest. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, 3 facing east. The sea was set on top of them, and all the rear parts turned inward. And it was a handbreadth thick. It was this thick. And its brim was made like the brim of a cup. As a lily blossom, it would hold 2,000 baths. Now, let's just talk about it real quick. Let's just get some. First of all, it was called the sea. That's the title of it. Why? Because it looked like a lot of water. Okay? And there's a purpose for this. Obviously, it's a bath, and we'll talk about that, but let's get some facts. First of all, it was made of cast metal. I don't know about you all. This thing was heavy. And I grew up as a kid. I've seen huge towering cranes over the city of Miami pulling up building projects so they could build. And I say, that's a job no one would want. What do? I'm a crane operator at 100 stories high. That's all I do. And I'm looking down and the city's moving. You know, it's like, what? But they have the ability to lift large loads up to the top of the building, wherever it needs to go. I don't know what lifted this thing. It's cast. What that means is it's one bowl together. It's one bowl. So you had to fire it. You had to do all the ironwork and make it in a cast and then put it in place. How did that happen? It's called manpower. A lot of it. And it's 15 feet in diameter. It's 7.5 feet high. It's 45 feet in circumference. It was decorated with gourds. Whatever. Some of you decorate your houses with gourds during Thanksgiving, right? So you all know what a gourd is. Unexciting to most of you. But it was, again, for ornamentation. It had 12 oxen, each facing a different direction of the compass that carried the weight. What were the oxen there for? To bear the weight. I don't know what else it is. What carried the load of the nation was oxen. The thickness was at least a handbreadth is sometimes 4 to 5 inches. I don't know if that's my hand. I had a small hand. Fletcher's hand is probably a little bit bigger, but 4 to 5 inches, maybe 6 inches. It would hold 2,000 baths. A bath is equal to 5 3/4 gallons. So basically, this thing held 11,500 gallons. In 2 Chronicles, there seems to be a problem because it says 2,000. What's the problem? 2,000 is normal capacity. 3,000 is total capacity. I don't see that's a contradiction. That's kind of easy. Why fill it to the brim when you got people getting in? You understand what I'm saying? Now, how the plumbing worked and how all that came about, I have no idea. But we do know something about it. It was used for basically cleansing. The priests had to go in there to cleanse. They had to go in. There's many different things they went through as far as cleansing and washing. And you want to be tedious? The cleanest people in the world at that time were priests. You said, well, they're dealing with blood. Yeah, the second they did, they took off their clothes, they threw them away, they bathed, they put on fresh linen, and they did it again. Took it off. Listen, I would be pruned forever if I was a priest. They were constantly washing, and you go through that in the Old Testament. I don't even know if they went through rinse cycles because they just put it on, got dirty, and went back in. So, but we do know that this was, again, purposeful. Again, it was, let's dissect the facts for a second. Cast metal. First of all, it was large. The word in Hebrew means it was poured out. Think about this for a minute. They had to heat the metal, whatever metal it was. In this case, we're not really sure. It doesn't tell us. We could say it was probably the same thing it was building the capitals out of. But you had to cast it. You had to get it hot, get the impurities out of it, and then they got so hot it was liquid, so they could pour the casting. It's a big thing. So it had to be done, and I would think it would take a tremendous amount of work, tremendous amount of calculations, a tremendous amount of manpower, and more than that, the tremendous power of skilled know-how. I was pouring a form a long time ago, just a small form, so I could put my kids' handprints in it. That to me was a tedious work. Measuring it, making sure it's right, and then making sure when you put the concrete in it, you don't put it on something that, all of a sudden it's stuck to the bottom. You had to do things so, and then put the kids' hands in when they're the right time. Where those are, they're at the other house, but we did that when the kids were younger. But they had to not only do all that work, they had to remove it from the cast. They had to remove it from that. They had to do the finished work to polish it and everything. And then they had to flip it and put it in place. So it's again, a feat fit for only one man at this time. Huram, the contractor. Why gourds? Why gourds? They're decorative. They were about 2 inches in diameter. They're known as what we would call watermelons today. Much smaller, different shaped, but they were of the cucumber genus. Okay, so sometimes we look at gourds and we say, we just hollow them out and make a birdhouse, kind of thing. That's not exactly that. It's used for medicine. Ready for this? It's a good laxative. Therefore, it's a good diuretic. It's also used for insect bites. I don't know how important all that is. They grew in very tough climates, though. So Israel was a very tough place to grow anything, and these things grew. Okay? They were also known as bitter apple, wild gourd. It was called the vine of Sodom. Don't go there. I'm just telling you what it's called. And they were bitter in taste sometimes. An interesting thought, though, it had 600 gourds. Again, they could be used in a stew in many places, but they were carved out images. And this is what Elisha had done, that put it in a stew so it was unable to be eaten. You'd have to go back to 2 Kings chapter 4. It could be used as a warning. Listen, put around the basin. It could be used as a warning, and this is what I believe the best application for this is. This basin was for priests only. You know how you go to a pool and say, please, kids use the little pool kind of thing, or whatever the pool may say. So this is limited to priests only, and only appointed priests could enter it, and the sign would say, death to others. In other words, you can say, hey, listen, can I throw a quarter in there and make a wish? That's not the purpose of this. It was just the purpose so the priests could be cleansed to approach God. Okay? What's up with the oxen and bulls? They pointed in different directions as a compass, and they carried the weight of the basin. Again, they were symbolic. First of all, they were symbolic of strength. They're carrying the basin. They're carrying the sea. They're carrying the load of the sea. The cast of the basin was one piece. It was very large. It had to be supported by something. You could not just put it on the earth. What would happen? Earthquakes, anything would shift, it'd roll, and that was it. So it was securely put on these, these beasts of burden. They're probably also a way to get into the basin and get out of the basin. Use the head as a ladder, maybe. In history, oxen could literally work themselves to death. Just think about that for a minute. When do they stop? When they drop. The imagery then could be that the untiring and successful labor of the service for the nation of Israel by the priests towards God. They were just constantly. That was a busy place. If you ever read about the temple, it was always going, always happening, always sacrifices. There was different courses of priests that were doing things. And the priests, remember this, were mediators between men and God. That's how man approached God. There was also movable 10 basins outside of this. In verses 22 through 40, it talks about these movable basins. I'll just give you the general facts behind these. We don't have to spend a lot of time in this. Basically, they were used for the preparing of sacrifices. They were 6 foot long, 6 foot wide, 4.5 feet high. They would move around. They each had borders of frameworks, which had lions and oxen. Again, everything was ornate. Everything was decorated. They had wreaths hanging from it. Each stand had 4 bronze or copper axles, we would say. Its 4 feet were held the supports. Basically, each stand had an 18-inch opening up top, so when the meat was cut and could be washed and all that stuff. The 4 wheels were 27 inches high. The four wheels looked like chariot wheels, all cast out of metal. Again, one cast. Metal wheels. Each had 4 supports. It was meant to put the cart in park. And what do we usually call that today? Okay, there's another word. If you're riding a bike, you use a what? A kickstand. So you put these things down, lock it, and it's not going anywhere. You need to move it, click it down, and move it somewhere else. So each stand had a basin extending 9 inches over the top. Each was engraved with cherub, lions, and palms. Again, I want to show you the ornateness of it. Each held 40 baths. So each one of these carts weren't little things, it's 230 gallons. It's not easy to move these things. There were 5 on the right side, 5 on the left side, which is, if you're looking at it, would be north and south kind of idea. Hiram's work was summarized in verse 41 through 47. Let's go to 41. 40. It says, now Hiram made the basin and the shovels and the bowls, so Hiram finished doing all the work which he performed for King Solomon in the house of the Lord, the 2 pillars and the 2 bowls of the capitals which were on the top of 2 pillars, the 2 networks to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals which were on the top of the pillars, and the 400 pomegranates for the 2 networks, 2 rows of pomegranates for each network would to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals were all on the tops of the pillars, and the 10 stands with the 10 basins of the stands, and the 1 sea, and the 12 oxen under the sea. Verse 45, and the pails and the shovels and the bowls, even these utensils which Hiram had made for King Solomon in the house of the Lord were polished. I'm going to say copper, but you can say bronze, because polished bronze to me sounds like what? Brass, but it's not brass. But again, what I want you to see is the ornateness of the care that was taken. In the plain of the Jordan, cast them, the clay around them between Sukkoth and Zarethan. And Solomon left all the utensils unweighed because they were too many. The weight of the bronze could not be ascertained. So much he did. Think of all the metal it took to make all these utensils. And they had to be, so it was calculatable. How much the weight was. So Zarethan and Sukkoth in this valley where they did the cast work was 35 miles north of the Dead Sea. So they have to come from north of the Dead Sea, if you remember the map, the Dead Sea, and all the way down to Jerusalem with this castings they've done. That's a lot. For those of you who don't understand the word, see me later, they did a lot of schlepping to bring this stuff down. It was a lot of work. And in 48 through 51, see, we're almost there. 48 through 51, we have the summary of this. Solomon made furniture for inside the temple. In verse 51, it says, thus all the work that King Solomon performed in the house of the Lord was finished. Hiram's finished, the inside's finished, the outside's finished, and now the furniture that go inside the temple, done. Okay, it goes on to say, and Solomon brought in the things dedicated by his father David, the silver, the gold, the utensils, and he put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. Now we're ready to rock and load. We're ready to use this place and for its exact purposes. In Jeremiah 25, 9 through 11, it says, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, declares the Lord, and I will send to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants, and against all these nations round about. And I will utterly destroy them and make them a horror and a hissing and an everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, and the sound of millstones and the light of the lamp. The whole land will be desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Why did I put that in there? Because this beautiful, ornate place will be destroyed by one king, taken apart piece by piece. Everything within the nation of Israel prior to that was what? We could say this. There was the voice of gladness, the voice of joy, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride. It was happiness. And then Israel, the southern kingdom, Judah, was taken into captivity, and his temple was destroyed. In 1 Chronicles chapter 36, if you could read this, you just passed the reading test. But we're going to finish with these verses. Well, let's do this. Let's turn to it. So, because I'm not going to be able to read this, and I'm looking right at it. Go to 2 Chronicles. There's a reason for this. Here's the reason. We're going to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 15. If you had a Hebrew Bible, ready for this? If you had a Hebrew Bible, this would be the last page of a Hebrew Bible. There's nothing after this. Malachi doesn't come after this. Nahum doesn't. This is the last book in the Hebrew Bible. So to me, it's pretty significant. So it says 36 verse 15. We're going to pick up there. And the Lord God of their fathers sent word to them again and again by his messengers because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. So God sent prophet after prophet to Israel to warn them. Because he had what? It said he had, which I think is really important, he had compassion on his people and his dwelling place. He dwelt there. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people until there was no remedy. They had grown so antagonistic to the Lord, there was no remedy. The power of the pomegranate wouldn't help. The dissecting of a gourd didn't fix anything. Therefore, verse 17, he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, Nebuchadnezzar, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. He killed the young people inside the temple. Some of them he took. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He had no compassion on the young men or the virgin, old man or infirm. He gave them all into his hand and all the articles of the house of God, great and small, all those utensils, all those carts, everything we talked about. And the treasures of the house of the Lord, the gold, the silver, the treasures of the king and his officers, he brought them to Babylon. He cleaned house and destroyed it. Then they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its fortified buildings with fire and destroyed its valuable articles. And those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon. And there were servants to him and to his sons under the rule of the king until the rule of the king of Persia, when Cyrus said, "You can go back." Okay? To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, which we just read, it would be 70 years in captivity. Until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths, all the days of the desolation, it kept Sabbaths until 70 years were complete. In other words, Israel was not worshiping God, and God was going to make them pay for it. And one of the things we see is this beautiful edifice called the house of the Lord that Solomon had hired people to bring in, that Solomon will, next chapter we're going to deal with, will dedicate to the Lord for his people to meet, for God to be in the midst, was gone. And today, there is not a temple standing in Israel. Where is God? Now, we know theologically God's everywhere. But the very presence of God was to be among his people so that his people could give out the message to the world and his people could be his people. Right? Now instead of the chosen people, they're more of the frozen people. And we have to pray for them and their salvation, but God will return one day to his people standing on the Mount of Olives, and he will return the tabernacle. Jesus Christ will return, and he will be in the midst of his people, Israel. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this time as we've diced through this last section of the building and the finishing of the temple. And Father, we know that you have a superior plan, and sometimes we don't always see it. And we know that you'll carry it out. We know that the promises you've made are just waiting to be fulfilled in our time. Father, again, we thank you for your wonderful hand upon all people, your wonderful word that we can take time to understand, to have a relationship with you. But more than that, we thank you for your Son, the true and coming King. And one day he will rule over this place, and he'll do it in such a fashion there'll be righteousness and justice throughout the entire world. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be dismissed.